Let's get centered.
Hi, I'm Louis Brand alongside Jeremy Murphy, and with us today is our special guest, former Senior Director at the National Security Council for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Juan Gonzalez. Juan, a good friend. We worked together during the Obama years when you were actually a career staffer at the State Department initially before coming over to the White House. But someone who understands the region perhaps better than anyone else at this moment. And so, really glad that you could join us and shed some light on all of the crazy things that are happening in the region now.
Thanks for having me. To the extent that I can help, I think it's hard to understand sometimes what's happening.
Yeah, indeed, it's weird times, to put it mildly. But Juan, you wrote this great piece for Foreign Affairs magazine in light of the removal of Maduro in Venezuela that really didn't get bogged down in the issues of the removal itself. I think a lot of the punditry has been so focused on like, oh my God, this was such a great military operation, that there was a lot less talk about what comes next. And you were one of the first people that I saw put out something really comprehensive on that in your op-ed in Foreign Affairs magazine. So I was hoping to start there, which is with this idea that just like George Bush had his mission accomplished banner, we may well be seeing a mission accomplished banner on the Trump administration's part in Venezuela.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And look, on that piece, it reflects really a lot of conversations that we had during the Biden administration. And one of the reasons we did not really use the military as our tool of first resort, which a colleague of mine, Dan Erickson, says that if the military, who also served under Biden, said that if the military is your first tool when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, then you're doing something wrong. And we I think our understanding was if we were to do something like that, removing Maduro is really the easy part. In the article, I talk about the end of the beginning. So now really there's this question about where things are going to go. And right now we're seeing basically a structure of continuity of the structures that have existed in the country for a very long time. So it's not regime change, it's autocrat change for the sake of basically the natural resources in the country and an effort to remove competitive international actors like China, Iran, and Russia. But there are many ways where this could go wrong. I mean, Rubio could pull this off, and I write in the piece, I try to be as objective as possible, that it would really change the paradigm of how the United States engages Latin America and the Caribbean. But there are also so many more reasons where this could go horribly wrong, including, a fragmentation of the coalition that is around the vice president who assumed power, Delcy Rodriguez. That could lead to violence. You have, I think, the ingredients in that country of a potential internal conflict. It's not Iraq, it's not Syria, it's not Libya, but it is Venezuela. And you, as a Colombian American, know what Colombia has been through. Those dynamics, I think, right now exist inside of Venezuela. And then the other, which is a managed transition toward democracy, doesn't really seem to be the focus of this administration. I'm really surprised how the shift on the objective has changed so drastically from really changing the regime to now really being about oil. And I think that is something, or at least right now, they're celebrating continuity, like you said, a mission accomplished moment in the short term. But everything we know about kind of history in Latin America and other parts of the world is that this approach without a democratic transition eventually is going to lead to chaos. And the implications for those problems for us are actually pretty significant, not just in terms of migration, but strategic opening for our competitors.
Trump had all the oil executives in the White House, and I think it was the CEO of Exxon who basically said, it's not worth investing in. It's going to be billions of dollars, and it's going to take years, and who knows what, strongman is going to be there. And Trump seemed genuinely surprised. And so I'm wondering, like, if the oil was part of this, why didn't they check with the oil executives who has to pay for the infrastructure?
You would think that they would check first. I mean, Exxon is a particular case because Venezuela owes them $1.6 billion. They've been in there a couple times and gotten burned. And of course, their main strategic interest is in Guyana. The largest discovery that Exxon has had in the last, I think, 2 decades was in 2015 in the Liza field off the shore of Guyana. That's their bread and butter. So whereas there's a lot of political risk and unproven reserves in Venezuela, I think this administration or the ExxonMobil would very much like the administration to be focused on Guyana. So I think there's there's I think a bias there on the part of ExxonMobil. But I am somewhat surprised that the president wasn't briefed on the reality that we all understand, which is that the benefit of oil and gas in Venezuela won't be seen until possibly after Donald Trump's term. And so, so I think they're going to have to rush to show benefits. But what we're seeing right now it worries me, and you've seen the reporting in the Financial Times and other places that those that are getting approvals, like to actually first start trading in the Venezuelan oil. What happened when the oil blockade was put into place? Venezuela started filling up its reserves, its storage capacity, and so they had a bunch of storage capacity. As soon as Maduro was changed, a bunch of oil traders were authorized. They were given licenses by the Treasury Department to be able to trade in this oil that was reserved and was sold to U.S. companies. Those that gotten those licenses are big donors of this administration. So, like my concern, and I think that this is where Congress has an important oversight role. I think especially if Democrats win the midterms, is we should see some transparency on those individual licenses, which are private. When OFAC issues a general license, that's public. It's announced. When it issues a license to an individual company, that's private, and only the company really is authorized to inform people that they have a license. And that, I think, is a huge opening for graft, not just inside of Venezuela, but also in the United States.
Yeah, and look, let me say that on the one hand, to be critical, one of the oil executives also pointed out that, like, yeah, we left in 2019 under your sanctions during your first term, Mr. Trump.
Exactly.
And the president wasn't happy about that. But to give them a little bit of credit, I want to touch on something. You got a little bit of blowback last year because you talked about the challenges of transitioning and how you needed to figure out how you worked on a transition with the Maduro regime so that you could actually ensure that there's going to be security and you don't end up essentially in a Iraq de-Baathification mess where the whole country falls apart. And you received a little bit of blowback on that. And yet I feel like you've been vindicated because that's exactly the analysis that the Trump administration and Rubio took forward, which was we've got to work with the people who were there. We force Maduro out or pull him out. And then we work with what's there to actually have like a responsible transition. So to some extent, they at least took part of your advice, if not directly. I feel like that's a vindication of where you were on that.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for some folks to call me with an apology, but I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I was demonized
Don't
by
hold your
those
breath.
I know. I was demonized by those hardline elements of the opposition when in fact what this administration is doing is they're just removing Maduro and like declaring that a win. We were very focused on what is a really hard thing to do, which is promote a democratic transition. I think maybe they saw it we saw it as a much longer time horizon. I think some in the hardline opposition still view with hope that Trump will at one point realize that they need to push for democratic transition. But I don't think that's going to happen. I do have to say some things, like there are things we did wrong. I think the best thing in policy, and you and I worked in this administration, Obama was like this, that he was very self-critical and would learn from mistakes. And I think in the policy world, that's really what you need to have good policy. And I think if I were to do that, I would say that I think the oil blockade was a good idea. Maybe we should have, sent destroyers off the coast of Venezuela right after the election and started seizing tankers to like make a point. So there are parts of Donald Trump that remind me that, the U.S. can be a ruthless international actor sometimes. I think he's taken it to an exponentially very negative level, but sometimes we got to throw our weight around, and maybe we should have done that. So I mean, I'll take that critique as a valid.
Yeah. No, that's fair. And I think the interesting thing is that some of the people who criticized you are now praising Maria Corina Machado for giving away her Nobel medal to President Trump, which is an acknowledgement of his strategy, which again is essentially the same thing. My concern is that whereas you advocated for something that would have been a more near-term transition to democracy, what I'm seeing is that the president doesn't have an interest in a democratic transition because, as he stated on day one, when we first heard of the assault on Caracas and the removal of Maduro, he doesn't want other actors to potentially get in there and take away anything that he thinks should belong to the United States. And so he's not looking for any kind of democratic transition yet. Is that your read of the situation too, or am I wrong to think that?
I think you're right, and I agree with that. I think Rubio has tried to put a positive spin on it by saying that this is a three-phased approach. Number one is stability. Number two is economic recovery. Number three is the transition. But I think what Rubio is assuming is that he will be President Rubio during that transition. But we have an election coming up. I don't think Trump is very focused on that. And even when Rubio has come to try to correct that, the president has doubled down on his focus, saying Maria Corina Machado is not ready to govern. And I think that's true. I think the mistake that the opposition maybe made in its pitch to the U.S. was really, I think even Trump probably realized was that putting Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado in the presidential palace of Miraflores would require, anywhere between 20 and 50,000 18 and 19-year-old Marines to ensure their security and their ability to govern. And that's something that, Trump did not want to, have to defend in a midterm election year. But two is not what he wanted, because he already has Delcy Rodriguez where he wants her. I think Maria Corina Machado could promise Trump the world, but he already has it. And he can threaten to put her in jail or threaten to reinvade. He has a lot of leverage over Delcy Rodriguez. And Delcy Rodriguez, who's a very smart operator, I think is also getting what she wants, right? Because she's going to be able to, basic coalesce support around Chavismo. She's going to be able to bring investment into the country. And even if you have an election a year from now, those Venezuelans who want to put food on the table are going to want continuity if she can deliver stability and prosperity. And so at that point, a fair and fair election may not produce an opposition victor.
Well, and not enough people are saying this, but essentially the Trump administration has aligned itself with a far left Bolivarian Chavista regime.
Yeah,
it's crazy. That to me just blows me away. And I thought that this whole scene where, you and I have been through many of foreign visits in the White House, and anytime that you have an actual meeting, you make a point to bring press in to show that an actual meeting took place. I only saw photos of the moment where she's giving him the trophy standing up. It's not clear to me that he welcomed her to sit down and actually have a real discussion. I don't know if that's clear to you.
Yeah, that's true. From what we know in the kind of presidential logistics, they probably really wanted to get a picture in the Oval, so it may have been like a what they call a grip and grin, when shake hands, grin, do a photo, and then see you later, as opposed to like a working meeting, right?
Yeah, and that's what it felt like to me, because they didn't release the photos. Now maybe they did the photo behind the scenes and
but
just
they would have
didn't want to
released that.
publicize it. But yeah,
The opposition would have released the two of them talking, sitting down.
Unless they were told they couldn't.
Yeah.
And so that's also the other thing that, like, you and I worked on the immigration issue a lot from different perspectives. I was at DHS. You've been working with partners all over the hemisphere to help facilitate the changes that were necessary to try to stem the flow throughout the region. And so what do you think this does in the long term to allies that we need to collaborate on any number of things, whether it's migration or security, countering cartels and other transnational criminal organizations? What's the real long-term impact? And I know that there's a little bit of alignment from right governments, and of course the more left governments are opposed, with the exception of Venezuela, which is now under Trump's thumb. But how do you see that dynamic playing out?
Yeah, I think right now, Rubio early on in his tenure talked about building an ideological alliance of countries of the right. And they've done that to a certain extent, and they've helped Javier Milei in Argentina actually support what they did, even though it generated a lot of political debate domestically. But I think the real division has been between countries that send migrants to the United States and those that do not. And, even, Noboa in Ecuador, he has had to be able to govern. He's had to give the U.S. everything they want on migration in order to get cooperation from the United States. And that's ideological alignment and more transactional. And I think that is something that I think probably scares a lot of leaders, because what it means is that the United States is going to act unilaterally, and that the region are spectators in U.S. foreign policy toward the Americas, number one. And number two, that in the transactional environment, you have nothing to offer. You have no value to this administration. And so that would lead countries. We see in Canada, the Prime Minister Carney made the first visit of a Canadian Prime Minister to China in over a decade. So countries like Canada are diversifying their economic and their strategic interests because they see the political risk coming from the United States. So in the short term, it's something that they can tell. Maybe during a presidential term, 4 years, you won't see the repercussions of that approach. But our reputation in the region has been damaged. Around the world has been damaged, because I think even if a Democrat comes in and tries to rebuild alliances and relationships based on partnership in the Americas, or tries to underscore the importance of NATO, I think the world is going to say, that's all nice and good, but what are we to expect 4 years from now? I think there's also this tendency in the executive where executive power is only expanded, you can't bring it back, right? And so the idea that that the next Democratic president is going to just curtail the power of the government and have it be like a much more functioning administration. I don't see an appetite for that inside of the Democratic Party. So you're going to see, I think, down the line a version. I mean, from my perspective as the Latin America guy, but like in the conversations I've been in, a lot of people don't have the appetite to just kind of try to bring back a Washington go along, get along approach. Now if you've established this baseline, Trump is establishing this baseline for executive power. Well, Democrats are going to use that to advance their interests. And I think in the long run, as a Latin Americanist, that's not good because we've seen that. You see how Guatemala functions as this kind of predatory relationship between elites and the government. Honduras, El Salvador, which is about really powerful, strong executive that is at confrontation and really isn't trying to be responsive to the people. That's like the Central Americanification of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean. Is not. I don't think it's good for us.
What incentive does any American company or financial institution or whatnot? What incentive do they have to go into Venezuela when they've had Chavez and Maduro? Like, they have a history of this. So if we're going to be there short term, why would a company invest?
Yeah, timeline is the key point, Jeremy. I think that companies may go in if they get pressured by Trump, and I think right now the idea that the United States would subsidize some of their investments gives me a lot of concern because basically what they're saying is taxpayers are going to subsidize international oil companies who are getting licenses based on their proximity to the president, right? The ethical connotations of that are, so we're going to foot the bill for Trump to benefit off of this. And that just, I think, is alarming from my perspective. The oil majors aren't going to rush in because they need a long-term time horizon and some sort of certainty. Even if Venezuela reforms its hydrocarbons law, they have to, for example, right now, PDVSA, the national oil company, has to have a majority stake in operatorship in all relationships. They have to change that to all private ownership. They have to have an independent central bank. They have to all these things to reassure the sanctity of contracts is something that IOCs need. They're also going to need to know that Democrats aren't going to come in and change everything around. And I think they're going to step with some trepidation until then. In the meantime, you're going to have the cowboys, the wildcatters, the smaller services companies are going to rush in because I don't think they can afford to stay out. Yeah. And they're going to try to position themselves and try to see if there's going to be like a high risk, high reward environment. And you're starting to see some of that, but that's not going to lead to a dramatic increase in production. I think the big winner here is frankly Chevron. Because they're the ones that are already in country, they're expanding their production, they have visibility on the ground, and so I think they're very well positioned to benefit from this.
And two fascinating things there that you said. One is that essentially instead of changing Chavismo and changing what Maduro was doing in Venezuela, we seem to be adopting the same tactics, which is just a stunning thing to think through. And then the second, that the Don Road Doctrine could survive even with Democrats, and that we may have to deal with this dynamic. But, to me, the region is not what it used to be. And you talked a little bit about this in your op-ed, where you talked about that this is where the Don Road Doctrine falls short. Military power is no longer the most effective tool for shaping outcomes in Latin America. In the Caribbean, you wrote, may have been in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but that the contest for influence in the hemisphere is about economic and technological, and that China recognized this a long time ago. So is it really realistic to think that the Don Road Doctrine can survive? I mean, I have to imagine that even countries that are playing nice are planning on how they safeguard and protect their sovereignty and negotiate and work with this administration in a way that doesn't bring in what they don't want.
Yeah. So, if you look at the history of American presidents in Latin America and the Caribbean, the cooperation post-Cold War was more the exception to the rule. A lot of U.S. presidents have actually been very bad to Latin America and the Caribbean. If you'll bear with me, I have an anecdote that I like to tell. So in like 1913, Teddy Roosevelt, after leaving the presidency, traveled to Brazil to explore this tributary to the Amazon known as the River of Doubt, and it nearly killed him. Right, he contracted malaria and ultimately was just permanently weakened. And what matters most is not really the adventure, but the mindset behind it. right? And I think Roosevelt believed, and I think a lot of presidents believe, that power requires presence, and that uncertainty had to be confronted like directly, and that hesitation also created a vulnerability. So I think that same worldview shaped his presidency, and his belief that the United States had to assert control in its own hemisphere rather than allow external powers to shape outcome. Now, I'm not romanticizing this worldview, but I think it's important, as Democrats even think about our role in the hemisphere, that story explains something enduring about American strategy, right? The instinct to treat proximity as responsibility, and uncertainty is something that needs to be managed through action rather than restraint. So I think Democrats need to have a much more muscular and robust foreign policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean than we've had in the past. And I think Trump's approach, which is using the military, tariffs, and leverage, are putting us at a strategic disadvantage relative to China, which has been using economic tools. They're integrated in Latin America supply chains, telecommunications infrastructure, the kind of oil and gas and critical minerals. They're winning that competition. And so we need to, I think, as Democrats, but I think more broadly as like American national security experts, is really think about how you actually treat Latin America and the Caribbean as stable stakes in terms of foreign policy. And for so long, it's been treated as kind of the third rail of foreign policy because there's so many domestic implications. I mean, you've believed that, felt this yourself for a long time. Latin America policy has been dominated by South Florida Republicans who negotiate with administrations with a suicide vest, right? They're just so hardcore. Yeah. Whereas others, don't see it as such a priority, and they basically cede that space to a hardline view of the Americas, which just doesn't pay off.
Yeah, our good friend, our mutual friend Carl Meacham and I wrote an op-ed for the Miami Herald about 10 years ago called talking about the interdomestic issues, those issues that are both international and domestic.
I'm fascinated with why Maduro did not leave on his own. He could be at the Ritz Paris right now. Instead, he's in a Brooklyn detention center. Like, did he not think we were going to do this? Like, what was his mindset?
Yeah, I do think that he, I think it's kind of the Cuban playbook, which is entrench yourself and try to wait out the United States. And it just didn't work on Venezuela. I'll tell you, the morning of this attack, I couldn't sleep. And at 1:30 in the morning, I went down a rabbit hole on ChatGPT based on what I know about the security situation inside Caracas, trying to figure out if a special forces operation was actually viable. And after 45 minutes of just going back and forth, I was like, look, it's a high denial environment. It's not possible. They've been coup-proofing that place for 26 years. Lo and behold, an hour and a half later, it happened. No, correlation, not causation. But it shows that, the U.S. probably spent $1 billion on that op, and it shows the strength of kind of U.S. special forces to do that. I think Maduro thought he was safe and that he could negotiate a better deal, and I think he was ill-advised. So, and these guys are also kind of, they live in a very paranoid, stovepiped environment. Their view of the world is so limited because they control the media. They believe their own hype. They're so closed off from the world that it's kind of wacky sometimes how they perceive their place in the world. And I think that maybe that hubris ended up what put him in Brooklyn and not in Paris.
Yeah, that's really funny and tragic for him, but also just an indication of just how he misread the situation, because I think there were pretty clear indicators on the international stage that the generals around him, if not Delcy herself, were willing to sacrifice him to stay in power and to cut deals. And so it's really fascinating that he didn't really perceive that. But, going back to like this mix of domestic and international issues, this crackdown on immigration also worries me, because I think what we saw in Minnesota when this American woman, a U.S. citizen, white woman, 37-year-old Renee Good, was shot in the face and in the shoulder, apparently, because she dared stand in front of ICE. And, they've tried to paint it as that she tried to ram him with her vehicle. I think a lot of people who watched that video believe that she was turning right to get out of the way after saying some nice words and telling him that she wasn't mad. But I think that, to me, the anti-immigration repression that we're seeing around the country is not just about immigration. I think what they're doing is that they're taking or they're weaponizing the issue to leverage the ability to build a federal law enforcement entity that they can then use to suppress dissent and dissidents in any number of other ways. And we're seeing it with Stephen Miller's chilling words, warning that federal agents have absolute immunity to do whatever they need to do. And we're seeing it in the chilling ways that Renee Good was treated. And we're seeing it in just the way that J.D. Vance came out afterwards, and the Department of Justice essentially said there's nothing to investigate here, nothing to look at. I mean, they Chief Quimby'd the whole scenario, nothing to see here with the fire burning behind them of the situation. And so if you take that to its logical extension, that the actions that we're seeing in Minnesota and across the country are about suppressing any kind of dissent, and if Delcy Rodriguez answers directly to Donald Trump, if there is any kind of uprising, protest, whether it's led by Maria Corina Machado or not, is the order from Donald Trump to Delcy to crush it, to suppress it? And are we going to see the type of things that we saw in Iran over the last couple of weeks, in Venezuela under Trump's control? Is that something that you think is realistic because he doesn't want his oil interests affected?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And for those of us who've like crossed a street in Latin America or other parts of the world, we've all had to dodge cars. When I saw that, I was like, oh, I've had that happen. I just kind of like move out of the way. And so it was pretty clear. But I think what the administration is asking us to do is to ignore our eyes as we kind of see what happened. But I think it's very true. I think what could end up happening in Venezuela is that it goes to what's called, by academics call, a bureaucratic authoritarianship, which means everybody's, people are living in comfort. They're going to work every day. They're putting food on the table. But at night, people who dissent disappear. This is kind of Chile, during Pinochet. People would be disappeared, and there wouldn't be any news about it because the news would be controlled. And so I think you may see a quiet crackdown to try to keep things in order, and that Trump will be fine with it. But I really appreciate you asking this question, Luis, because I think the Venezuela policy and our domestic immigration policy is very interrelated, because what this president did, these unilateral strikes against alleged drug traffickers, which would normally not be a capital offense, they would be tried, and jailed, is it ignores the U.S. Constitution, the UN Charter, and the War Powers Resolution. It shows that this president believes that he is above kind of U.S. law, and I think that same approach is one that is being used domestically. And I think the legal justification that the Office of Legal Counsel provided to the president to justify these attacks basically suggests that the president can designate anyone as an enemy combatant, and that enemy combatant is not entitled to the rights and freedoms, or to the human rights protections that are afforded by international law. Domestically, if you are designated as an enemy combatant by this administration, you may not be entitled to the due process that you are due to as an American, and you could get jailed without due process. You could have your assets seized without due process, or God forbid, you could be killed in a kinetic operation because your president has designated you as an enemy combatant. So I think what happened to Renee is, and the rush to identify her as a terrorist is really where they make the bridge from killing people in boats in the Caribbean to treating anybody who is a voice of dissent or opposition domestically as an enemy combatant because they dissent with what the president wants to do.
Yeah. No, I think that it is really chilling. Exactly how you put it is incredibly chilling. And I think it's also, to be fair, and we call this centered because we try to be centrist. This is authority that President Obama used during his first term when a U.S. citizen considered a senior Al-Qaeda operative was targeted in a drone strike in Yemen. And so in that case, the idea of what an enemy combatant looked like was much clearer, and you could sort of say that like it was justified, but it's essentially the same authority that they're now stretching out in the way that they did in off of the Caribbean, and in the way that they seem to be wanting to do domestically. I've tried to draw this parallel because the boat strikes to me don't seem significantly different than like if you were to take that logical idea that anyone who's transporting drugs that can cause the death of Americans is considered a narco-terrorist. Well, one of the realities is that most of the prosecutions for drug trafficking in the United States are of U.S. citizens. And one of the things that the cartels do that is so sinister but so frankly effective for them is that they recruit young kids. They recruit teenage boys primarily, although girls too. They recruit teenagers along the border who are American citizens to go pick up the drugs and run them in. And so if you were to extend that logic, you'd be blowing up pickup trucks of American citizen teenagers along the border. So it's just a flawed strategy in so many ways and just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think the only difference, Luis, and I align myself with the view to kind of analyze these policies objectively and to not politicize them. Under Obama, the courts got involved. In this case, Renee didn't even get a chance, right? There are rules of engagement that we were very focused on in respecting, right? There were priority enforcements. There was still a legal framework around which Obama tried to really push that approach on enemy combatants. Where Renee was not given that opportunity. She was not detained, charged with anything. She just shot in the face. And I think that's really worse. I think we also, on the fentanyl question, which you get to, is I think we need to remember that like over 80% of the fentanyl that is smuggled into this country is smuggled in by American citizens. And none of it comes from Venezuela. So this administration's justification, first, it was drugs, right? And, I think less than 10%, less than 8% of the cocaine that enters the United States comes from Venezuela. No fentanyl comes from Venezuela. Then it was terrorism. But if you see in the case against Maduro, the prosecutors dropped this whole allegation that he's the head of this terrorist infrastructure. So a lot of these arguments that the administration is making to justify its interests, they fall apart when it gets to courts, right?
Yeah.
And I think right now, when it comes to the debate in this country, courts have been basically a fail-safe or the only check on Trump's power because Congress hasn't been doing it.
Yeah. Incredible. And so we have Trump on his way to Davos. He's extending this power-hungry kind of dynamic to trying to get Greenland over the objections of just about every ally in Europe and, of course, the Danish and the people in Greenland themselves. How do you read this moment? And do you, my concern is he's doing this really to break up the NATO alliance. I don't see that there's a legitimate reason to do this otherwise, because we could have expanded bases without insisting that we have to own it. And then overnight, the president publishes this ridiculous social media post where it shows him as president of the United States, Canada, Greenland, Venezuela, and Cuba with an AI-generated image. It seems not serious and it would be laughable, but for the fact that he's on his way to Europe, ostensibly to chastise our European allies and try to force his hand to try to get Greenland. How are you seeing that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that this has less to do with Greenland. I mean, it may be Trump's approach to negotiations is take a maximalist position, then negotiate down. I don't totally understand that because, as you mentioned, Greenland has offered him to have a base. They've offered cooperation on critical minerals. They basically offered him everything he wants without having to own Greenland. But I see it more as also right now, nobody's talking about Ukraine. So this has been a way to kind of completely shift the focus away from, Europe's focus away from actually helping Ukraine defend itself against the invasion of Russia to really about the future of NATO and how that's going to work. And I think the countries of Europe, I don't see them, opposing Trump militarily or economically to defend Greenland because they can't. And so I think this is something that could fundamentally.
But you had German troops arriving in Greenland this week, and I think people the world over kind of celebrating it and holding their breath because, oh my God, finally we're getting some reinforcement of troops here. So in case the United States tries anything.
Yeah, but if the U.S. wants to take Greenland, they will take Greenland. I don't think the president will physically try to do that. I think he's going to try to get some particular arrangement from the Europeans and from Greenland more than I think was offered. But I think at the core of this too is I think Trump going to Davos is going to be interesting because his worldview is a fundamentally a belief that globalization has weakened the United States and its sovereignty, that interdependence is no longer seen as stabilizing. It's more like risky, and that economic openness is no longer neutral. It's a source of political vulnerability. So I think this is where domestic and foreign policy are now like treated as an integrated system. Immigration, trade, industrial policy, national security are all completely together. So I think ultimately, and I could be wrong. I was wrong about there not being extraction of Maduro, is that he's going to try to seek some major deal or capitulation on the behalf of Europeans that they haven't already given.
Yeah, you won't see me open up any accounts on Polymarket anytime soon.
I have a question. I was reading something about the EU has kind of like the nuclear option. and they can just, go after American companies, regulation, taxes, and everything. How feasible is that? Do you see that being a threat that Trump is scared of?
It's interesting because at the beginning, when Trump started threatening putting tariffs on Europe at the beginning of his administration, all of us, and I stay in touch with a lot of, folks in the Biden administration, like Blinken, Sullivan, all those folks who are, have big brains and are thinking about this. And the view was that Europe being as a whole, being such a large economy, has the ability to push back on Trump's and his tariffs if they basically, in a united way, reciprocate on those tariffs or retaliate. And what we saw in practice was that Europe could not stay united on this, and they capitulated on these agreements. So I think it'll be a function of, can Europe, will Trump actually force European unity in practice? Whereas, I think before the Trump administration, people were starting to talk about whether the European Union would survive until 2030, given just the fragmented nature, the political divisions. Maybe Trump is actually going to be what forces Europe to actually work on its economic interest in a coordinated way.
Even weaning them off of Russian energy was a difficult thing over the recent years over Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly Germany wanted to kind of be able to work with both sides, and it was very, very difficult.
Yeah. Well, Juan, this has been an incredibly valuable conversation. I think, the reality is that we're in such a worrying time right now, because my concern is that they've built the mechanisms to perhaps maintain order in what is a newly destabilized but world that pays attention and does what Washington tells them to do, or it could just entirely destabilize us in ways that we can't predict, and that will be really dangerous for years to come. So I really appreciate your time on this, man, and thank you for that piece you wrote again for Foreign Affairs Magazine. I thought that was a great piece. We're going to link to it here, and look forward to having you back so we can keep talking about this when we see if your predictions have held out.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
That was a great conversation. I'm really glad we got the chance to have him on to talk about this.
Yeah, it's great because you come to this with preconceived notions of stuff, and then you have these experts who, acknowledge your premise, but then kind of break it down, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I don't know everything.
I never thought I did. But Jeremy, before we let you go, because a lot of stuff has happened too, is now we're seeing that Netflix has changed its offer for Warner Brothers to a cash deal. What's the latest on what's happening there? Is that such a crazy corporate intrigue?
Well, yeah, I mean, their market cap, like $160 billion down. And, when they're offering stock and money, that stock, the value keeps going down. So they had to do something. So the all cash offer, I think is serious. It's less of a headache. The question is CNN, because Netflix Netflix doesn't want it. Warner wants to sell it. And MSNBC, part of NBC or Comcast, spun off all their cable networks into a publicly traded company called Versant, and the value just keeps plummeting. So people are just kind of like, the cable assets of Warner Discovery are not that valuable, and so you have to measure it against Paramount Skydance is offering to buy everything, versus this thing with Netflix. And also, there's the regulation, there's the getting through the government. I think Larry Ellison's relationship with Trump is going to tip the scales on this, because they don't have the conflicts, whereas Netflix, because of Netflix and HBO Max, they're going to have a monopoly on streaming.
So you're still thinking that Paramount will win the day?
I think Paramount's going to win the day. I think it's going to be very long. This is going to happen. This is going to be like a year, 2 years in. And a lot of these, they have a breakup fee. If the Netflix Warner Discovery thing doesn't go through, Netflix owes them like $3 billion or something. So, it's high stakes. You can tell they're getting annoyed Warner's getting annoyed with Paramount Skydance because, they keep going back, and now we're going to go to shareholders. Now we're going to make it hostile because industry-wise, economically, Paramount Skydance really needs Warner Discovery to
Yeah.
survive.
Yeah.
They really need that, and it's kind of like fighting for your life. So they really need it, and I think they're really pissed that Netflix came in, at the last minute with this tantalizing offer, and now it's all cash. It's even more of an incentive.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, I think what a great way to kick off our 2026 season 2 here, folks. So
Yep.
Thank you for your time, and thanks to everyone who listened and who joined us. And share, hit subscribe, and help us get the word out. There's a lot of good information in here.
Yep.
Thank you. Our panel featured Louis Miranda, former Obama White House communications advisor and former spokesperson at DHS, and Jeremy Murphy, former CBS executive, author, and publicist.